Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Meyer, and I'm podcasting from Malu Dumim in Israel. When it comes to the subject of God, we all have opinions. The first great divide is whether or not God exists. Opinions tend to be very certain on this question. But when it gets to finer details about God's nature, assuming God exists to begin with, things get a bit more murky. For instance, questions about God's absolute control over things are very up in the air. So are matters of God's interaction in our lives and in reality in general. Then there are the real sticky questions about God's personality. Even suggesting that God has a personality can be hazardous in certain circles. For some, it is simply too much to pin such a human-like quality on the Almighty. For others, taking away any sense of personality from God is akin to sacrilege. Doing so would make God into a kind of machine, like a divine version of a computer. This debate will never be resolved, for it cuts to the very core of human beliefs. A related question concerns God's desires. Even those who maintain that God has nothing resembling a human personality may admit that God does have something resembling a will. Will is either deemed so elevated on the human scale that they say that even God possesses it, or it is so basic to the whole idea of a being who created everything for a purpose that there is simply no way to avoid it. Will implies some sort of agenda. It also very possibly includes such mundane things as desires. But attributing desires to God really cuts things close as far as personality is concerned. Desires are quite personal. It is hard to imagine an amoeba having them. There has to be someone there to be desiring something. There have to be likes and dislikes. There may have to be something resembling emotions. All of this is highly problematic for those who believe God to be infinitely above such paltry things. Every believer has to make a very personal choice on such issues. Simply accepting the beliefs or the theology of others won't work for matters like this that demand true belief. Depending on one's religious orientation, one might consult an authoritative text like the Bible to get some guidance on such questions. How else are we to forge any sort of opinion on any of this? Nothing can be proven one way or the other, so perhaps it makes sense to look back at the book that probably did more to formulate the idea of God in the collective human mind than any other. But even here, the diligent searcher may find that getting a definitive answer is easier said than done. There are times when God seems very removed from anything that smacks of wants and needs. But more often, the biblical God appears to be positively filled with them. God gets angry at disobedience and happy at devotion. God has very clear goals and makes no secret about them. Sometimes God seems helpless to achieve those goals and is desperate for people to push things along. If these aren't desires, it is hard to know what to call them. Then there are the real physical desires that are classically identified with the senses. It is not unusual to encounter God wanting to hear someone or hoping to see something happening. God senses pain or joy with inspiring closeness. Even more towards the physical, God can experience taste or smell. This is where things get very dicey, and this week's Parsha has them with disturbing frequency. The Parsha is called Vayikra. That word means, and he called, an introduction to a verse about God calling to Moshe from the tent of the tabernacle. Immediately following this, the subject moves to what the entire Parsha deals with, sacrifices. There are animal sacrifices of all kinds, plus offerings of flour mixed with oil and frankincense, and occasionally some libations of wine. The animal sacrifices come in three main categories, each with a few variations, plus several rarer offerings that are either seasonal or for special occasions. The three main offerings, all of which are covered to a great degree in this week's Parsha, are the Ola, or burnt offering, the Hatat, or sin offering, and the Shlamim, or peace offering. Each of these has many applications and also a few offshoots that go by different names. The Ola, or burnt offering, is called so because it is the only one that is completely burned on the altar. None of it is meant to be eaten. For this reason, it used to be translated into older forms of English as Holocaust. Obviously, that term is no longer appropriate for this purpose. There are special rules for these offerings that make them completely different from the others, even though to someone who isn't familiar with the various types, they would all seem more or less the same. The common denominator between them is that they entail the slaughtering of a kosher animal and that the blood of the animal must be sprinkled somewhere around the altar. The burnt offering has so many applications that it is impossible to pin it down to a single purpose. The main unifying theme behind them is that it is completely given over to God, since none of it is consumed by people. The sin offering is what it sounds like, a sacrifice to achieve atonement for some transgression. In general, the transgressions that sin offerings are brought for are those which have been done inadvertently. Those which were done deliberately cannot be atoned for with animal sacrifices. Sin offerings are eaten by the priests officiating the proceedings, with certain parts being burnt on the altar. They have a very specific purpose and are generally brought by private individuals who are in need of atonement. A variation of the sin offering is what is called a guilt offering, which is more or less the same thing with a slightly different application. The peace offering can be either private or public and has the general purpose of enhancing the relationship between people and God. While that definition does not fit all peace offerings, it is about as close as we can get to a common theme. They are eaten by the person who brings them, but again, certain parts are burnt on the altar. They come with many applications, including the so-called Thanksgiving offering and several others that share this general purpose. Their holiness is deemed slightly less than that of the burnt offering or the sin offerings. A fourth type of offering, also covered in the Parsha, is the flour offering. This is called the mincha, a word which appears many times in the book of Genesis, meaning gift. There are numerous applications of this offering, all with the idea that it is considerably less costly than any animal offering and thus reckoned as a kind of gift. These tended to be the offerings of the poorer people for whom an animal was too expensive to afford. They are almost invariably accompanied by oil, which was mixed in with the flour, along with frankincense as a spice. A certain portion of this offering was scooped off to be burnt on the altar, while the remaining was eaten, usually by the priests. There is a huge amount of space dedicated to these offerings in the Torah. For many, this is a bit disturbing. Most people find the details to be confusing to the point of not even attempting to make sense of it all. In addition, there is the basic problem of not really relating to this entire mode of worship. The killing of animals, along with the sprinkling of the blood, is simply too much for many. They prefer more spiritual or more moral forms of devotion to God, and all these offerings seem like a thing from the ancient past that we have moved on from millennia ago. It is not easy to form a cohesive response to the problem of irrelevance of the offerings. Judaism tends to shelve the issue to the theoretical, leaving it in the prayers and pushing off any qualms about the whole system until the temple is rebuilt and things can go back to the way they were before. There is one crucial phrase that accompanies many of these offerings, particularly the animal sacrifices. That phrase is, quote, a pleasant fragrance to Hashem. This phrase describes the aroma of the offering as whatever parts of it are burning on the altar. While many people are attracted to the smell of burning meat, and some are repulsed, almost everyone is puzzled by the idea that God would be somehow pleased with the fragrance of meat burning on an altar. Why would God, the creator of the universe and the omnipotent source of all existence, be turned on by something as mundane as a ritual barbecue? This is an extremely difficult question to answer. Many Jewish thinkers through the ages have attempted to justify this expression one way or the other, but they tend to ring a bit hollow to modern ears. The standard approach is that it really doesn't mean anything physical like an actual aroma, but is simply a way of saying that God desires these offerings. It seems that the most unapologetic response to this question is to say that according to the biblical view, God was indeed pleased with this smell. While this may seem impossible or antithetical to people today, that does not appear to have been the case in ancient Israel. Their idea of God was not necessarily the same as ours, even though we carry on a tradition of believing in the same God. Their idea included the notion that God truly desires this fragrance, and that it represented one of the primary forms of attaining some sense of a relationship with God. The fact that this may be a very foreign or even repulsive idea to people today only illustrates the great variety that exists within people of the same basic belief. Most of Judaism has long moved on from this conception of God. We no longer can stomach the idea that God desires these aromas, or that there is such a thing as a pleasant fragrance to Hashem. We translate this phrase to mean something completely different, something that fits better with our notion of God. This process began in Judaism almost 2,000 years ago. With the destruction of the temple, the very idea of sacrifices became more of a wishful dream than a practical reality. Ways of understanding God changed through those long centuries, and God became more of an idea in the mind than an entity in the heavens who could smell the fragrance of our offerings. Are we more advanced theologically or spiritually than they were? Perhaps, but who really knows if in giving up this semi-human and almost physical conception of God, we lost a connection to something that was real as the earth we live on. We all have to find God in our own way. For some, it is through the mind, for others through the soul, and for still others through the notion of desire. Shabbat Shalom.